Welcome, brave souls, to another episode of our scary stories. I'm your host, the Keeper of Fears, inviting you to step into the abyss of the unknown. Tonight, we bring you an extraordinary tale that straddles the borders between science and the supernatural, between ambition and hubris, between life and, well, something far more chilling. Buckle up, listeners, for a journey through the crumbling corridors of a place known as EternaLife, where time and space unravel, and where the very fabric of reality threatens to tear at its seams. This is the cryogenic nightmare, a story that asks, what would you sacrifice to save the world you'll never see? Leonard's eyes flickered open, pierced by a cold that bit through his skin and into his bones. The frigid air was so sharp it seemed almost solid, congealing around him like a prison of ice. Shivering, he took stock of his surroundings. The soft hum that should have filled the air was replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the sputtering of fluorescent lights struggling against the dark. His gaze fell upon a spiderweb of cracks that marred the glass lid of his cryogenic pod. It looked as though someone, or something, had struck it forcefully. As his pod hissed open, plumes of frosty mist escaping into the room, Leonard staggered out, his legs wobbly, his thoughts disoriented. His first step landed on shards of a shattered monitor. The glass crunched under his bare foot, sending a jolt of pain up his spine. How could this happen? This facility was EternaLife, the epitome of cutting-edge technology, designed to carry its occupants to a future where illness was a mere shadow of a bygone era. That was why he'd come here, after his terminal diagnosis. Leonard's eyes shifted to the nearby control panel, its screen riddled with static and lines of garbled text that could only mean one thing: system malfunction. Grimacing, he leaned on a steel counter, his fingers dancing over the panel, searching for a hint of what had gone wrong. A timer caught his eye. He had been programmed to wake up a century from now, but according to the digits blinking erratically on the screen, it had only been 20 years. 20 years, and yet the facility looked like it had been through an apocalypse. Frustration mixed with fear as Leonard recalled his past. He had been a pioneer in his field, a physicist, a seeker of the unknown. He remembered the contract, the glossy brochures of EternaLife, promising a seamless journey through time. Now, his investment seemed to be a one-way ticket to an unscripted nightmare. A low groan reverberated through the walls, jolting Leonard from his thoughts. That sound did not belong to any machine. His skin tingled as if electric currents flowed beneath it. He considered his options. The computer system was useless, doors to other sections appeared to be sealed or barricaded with furniture, and he was decades away from when help was expected. His eyes darted to a fire extinguisher hanging on a wall, and a toolbox below it, primitive, but they were better than bare hands. Just as Leonard decided to venture deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of EternaLife, he heard it, a faint whisper, slithering through the gaps in the walls, a murmuring so low it could almost be mistaken for the wind. But there was no wind here, in the sealed haven of science and ambition turned to. His hand gripped the fire extinguisher like a lifeline. The room seemed to close in, the walls dripping with a cold sweat, the lights flickering as if in morbid anticipation. Leonard felt an abyss open inside him, swallowing his scientific skepticism, leaving him with an instinct as ancient as the darkness around him, the instinct of fear. No, he couldn't let it take over, not if he wanted to survive whatever awaited him in the frozen, eerie hallways of EternaLife. But the whisper grew into a sigh, filling the room, swirling the mist, chilling his bones even through the dread that warmed them. This was not what Leonard had planned for his future, but it was the future he found himself in, a derelict realm of ruin and shadows, and perhaps worse. Shaking off the fog of trepidation, he gripped his makeshift weapon tighter. Whatever lay ahead, whatever monstrous realities had supplanted the future he'd envisioned, he would face them. His fingers, cold and trembling, pressed against the door's release button. With a resigned sigh, the door slid open, revealing the abyss beyond. Leonard took a deep breath to steady himself, filling his lungs with the frigid, stale air. Then, lifting the fire extinguisher like a knight brandishing a sword before battle, he stepped into the dark unknown. The door slid shut behind him, sealing with a mechanical thud that sounded like the final note in a requiem. But for Leonard, it was an overture, a haunting prelude to a symphony of uncertainties that would unravel in the labyrinth that lay ahead. The corridor stretched out before Leonard like a tunnel into darkness, the air thick with the scent of rust and stagnant water. The overhead lights blinked in and out, casting pools of light swallowed almost instantly by the engulfing black. His grip on the fire extinguisher tightened as he ventured deeper into the cold abyss of the EternaLife facility. Leonard's steps echoed on the metal floor, each footfall reverberating through the corridor. Anxious, he strained his ears, trying to discern other sounds that didn't originate from his own movements. And there it was, a scuffling, a soft murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He paused, his eyes scanning the dark, searching for any shape or form that might account for the noise. Nothing. As he continued forward, Leonard discovered a door slightly ajar, with the words "Maintenance Room" inscribed on a tarnished plaque. Cautiously, he pushed it open. The room was a mess, shelves toppled over, tools scattered everywhere, but it was a treasure trove for his immediate needs. Quickly, he exchanged the fire extinguisher for a heavy wrench and grabbed a flashlight whose beam flickered uncertainly. They were crude armaments, but they gave him a sliver of hope. Exiting the maintenance room, Leonard was now certain that he wasn't alone. Shadows flitted across the edges of his vision, always just beyond the reach of his flashlight. A low growl, more felt than heard, rumbled through the hallway, as though resonating from the very walls. It was a sound devoid of any humanity, a sound that echoed from unfathomable depths. His pulse quickening, Leonard's eyes darted from corner to corner. Then he saw it, a fallen workstation just a few feet away, its screen still aglow with a dim light. He rushed towards it. Maybe it held some answers. As he skimmed through the logs, lines of text were obscured by corrupted data, making much of it unreadable. What he could make out, however, sent a shiver down his spine far colder than the air around him. Security log 20430718. Breach in Sector C, unknown entities. Perimeter compromised. Do not approach. They feed on. The sentence cut off there, but that final fragment filled Leonard with a dread far deeper than he had felt before. Feed on what? Then a horrifying realization dawned on him. These entities fed on the frozen souls, the very people who, like him, sought sanctuary in suspended animation. As if on cue, the air thickened, becoming almost dense enough to touch. The overhead lights flickered out, plunging the corridor into an impenetrable dark. Leonard's flashlight sputtered and died, as if drained by an unseen force. He felt it then, the presence of something malevolent and hungry, just inches from him in the pitch black, breathing in the scent of his living soul. His heart pounding in his chest, Leonard grasped the wrench tighter, aware that the entities knew he was awake. In that moment of paralyzing darkness, the invisible hunters of EternaLife began their insidious prowl. For the first time, Leonard understood. His waking nightmare was part of a much greater horror, one that gnawed not just on the body, but feasted on the essence of the soul itself. He took a deep, shuddering breath, a mix of frosty air and palpable dread. It was time to move. Leonard's fingers fumbled for a backup switch on his flashlight, praying it would spring back to life. It did, casting a feeble light that barely pierced the darkness. But it was enough. Clutching his makeshift weapon, he pressed on, knowing he had to find a way to stop these unseen hunters before they drained the life from every frozen soul in the facility, including his own. For Leonard, the EternaLife facility had transformed into an arena of shadows and terror. But whatever awaited him in that dark maze, he would face it. The alternative, doing nothing, was a fate too grim to contemplate. With a newfound resolve, he moved deeper into the unknown, a single living soul against a lurking, insatiable darkness. The cold air nipped at Leonard's face as he moved cautiously down another corridor, flashlight in hand, the wrench gripped tightly in the other. His breath misted the air, vanishing as quickly as it appeared, just like the shadowy figures haunting the outskirts of his perception. He tried to shut out the sense of ever-watchful eyes upon him, but the nagging feeling grew with every step he took. His flashlight beam settled on a door unlike any he had seen so far in the facility. Intricate patterns of circuitry embedded into the door's surface seemed to ripple and shift, giving the impression of a portal rather than a simple entrance. The plaque read Time Reversal Chamber. Puzzled, Leonard reached for the access panel beside the door. It flickered to life under his touch, indicating it was still operational, a rare anomaly in this desolate facility. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a room filled with unrecognizable equipment and consoles adorned with swirling holographic displays, most frozen in place, as if time itself had stopped for them. Curiosity overcoming trepidation, Leonard stepped in. The air here was different, charged with static electricity that made his hair stand on end. An array of classified documents lay strewn across a central table, their contents veiled in scientific jargon. But certain phrases stood out. Phrases like temporal rifts, dimensional instability, and chronological feedback loops. Leonard's heart sank as he pieced together the clues. EternaLife wasn't just in the business of prolonging human life. They had been dabbling in bending the fabric of time itself. The chamber, and possibly others like it, were part of a shadowy experimental project that went far beyond ethical boundaries. And it became increasingly clear that these experiments may have torn open the very rifts that let those malevolent entities into this world. A ripple of unease surged through Leonard as he examined a holographic interface that surprisingly responded to his touch. A 3D model of the facility appeared, overlaid with undulating waves and fluctuating numbers. An overlay of multicolored lines zipped and darted around the model, representing, Leonard assumed, the flow of time within the facility. Most lines moved linearly, but a few spiraled erratically, vanishing and reappearing at random points. The entities weren't just from another dimension, they were from another time. And worse, they seemed capable of manipulating time itself, an insight that amplified their danger exponentially. Leonard thought of the frozen souls around him, of their suspended journeys through time. What if these entities had the power to manipulate that as well? Suddenly, the room darkened, as if shadows had swallowed the sparse lighting. Leonard felt a piercing gaze on him, colder than any temperature the cryo chambers could reach. He turned, flashlight sweeping across the room. Then he saw it, or thought he did, a flicker, a distortion in the air, a shadow darker than the absence of light. It appeared for just a fraction of a second, but long enough to make his blood run cold. The entities were here, perhaps curious about his newfound knowledge, or perhaps drawn to the room's temporal energies. His body tensed, adrenaline surging through him. The wrench felt heavier in his hand, and he tightened his grip as if clinging to the seconds ticking away. Every cell in his body screamed at him to flee, but Leonard knew he needed to delve deeper into the abominable secrets that bound EternaLife to these dark beings. He stepped back, never taking his eyes off the spot where the shadow had flickered, and exited the room, sealing the door behind him. As he made his way back into the corridor, Leonard pondered the new, terrifying layer of complexity the time reversal chamber had added to his situation. The entities stalking him were no mere monsters. They were phantoms of time, ravenous for souls, unbound by the physical laws that anchored humanity. Time, Leonard mused, could be both a weapon and a weakness for these entities. If he could just understand their connection to it, maybe he could find a way to seal the rift and banish them back to their incomprehensible realm. But with each tick of the clock, or whatever passed for time in this cursed place, Leonard knew he was running out of it. The entities were getting bolder, and his life, along with those frozen in eternal sleep, was balanced on a razor's edge. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, each footstep echoing into the abyss of flickering lights and unyielding darkness. Leonard's flashlight beam moved restlessly from side to side, catching brief glimmers of frosty cryopods, their transparent covers like glass coffins displaying eternal sleepers within. Then he saw it, a room at the end of the corridor bathed in an eerie glow, unlike the harsh, artificial luminance that barely sustained the rest of the facility. Leonard's intuition, honed in a crucible of peril and dread, sounded a silent alarm. The glow seemed alive, malignant. Summoning his courage, Leonard moved forward, wrench clutched tightly, until he reached the room's threshold. What he saw within nearly brought him to his knees. The cryopods in this chamber were encircled with ethereal threads of light, almost like veins pulsing with luminescent blood. The threads converged at the center of the room into a churning vortex of energy, an ominous storm of swirling hues and shades. Leonard's scientific mind raced, piecing together the horrifying tableau before him. The entities were harvesting souls, storing the stolen energy in this dark whirlpool. And the most terrifying revelation hit him like a thunderbolt. The day of mass reanimation, the day when thousands were to wake up from their frozen slumber, was the day this vortex would reach its apocalyptic potential. On that day, the entities would have enough energy to fully manifest in the world, breaking the tenuous dimensional barriers that so far contained them. His eyes darted around, desperately searching for a way to stop this abominable process. Then he saw it, a pod at the far end of the room, less entangled in those spectral threads than the others. The name tag on the pod made his heart skip a beat. It was Jenna, an old friend and colleague from what seemed like another lifetime. Could he save at least one soul from this harrowing fate? With a surge of determination, Leonard rushed to the pod's control panel. The screen flickered as he accessed the emergency protocols. Sweat trickled down his brow as he coded a command to divert the energy drain away from Jenna's pod. As he executed the command, he saw the ethereal threads around her pod dissipate and vanish, their ghostly glow dimming as if starved. Just as he exhaled a sigh of relief, a guttural growl filled the room. The temperature plummeted, the ambient light dimming as if being consumed. A shadow detached itself from the darkness, a formless, swirling mass of blackness, its presence a pit of malevolence that seemed to pull the very light into it. It was one of the entities, and it was aware of Leonard's interference. His muscles tensed for combat, but rational thought prevailed. He couldn't fight this. Leonard bolted, wrench and flashlight abandoned on the control panel, his survival instinct screaming at him to run. He dashed through the labyrinthine corridors, hearing the inhuman growl fade into a hiss, like steam quenching on hot metal. He knew he'd barely escaped. The entity was palpably angry, but still bound by some unspoken rules or limitations. Breathless, Leonard halted to lean against a wall, feeling the cold surface press against his forehead. He knew he had just scratched the surface of this dark tapestry woven with science and the paranormal. But for the first time since awakening in this frozen hell, he felt a flicker of hope. It was possible to interfere with their plans. It was possible to fight back. And so, as Leonard pushed away from the wall, his heart pounded not just with the fear of the unknown threats lurking in the shadowy depths of EternaLife, but also with the resolve to defy the apocalypse the entities so meticulously planned. Time was of the essence, and he couldn't afford to waste another second. Leonard's shoes squeaked against the sterile floor as he hurried through a maze of hallways. Each turn was a gamble, each corridor a potential dead end, or worse, a lurking ambush by the insidious entities haunting the facility. His eyes caught a glimmer of light ahead, steadier than the erratic flickers that haunted most of the building. As he approached, Leonard found himself in front of a glass door, behind which was a room ablaze with the light of multiple monitors, control panels, and a colossal screen at the center. Control room, the plaque next to the door read. Using an emergency override code, Leonard stepped inside. The room hummed with a strange vibrancy, as if it were the nerve center of this ghostly body. His eyes were immediately drawn to the massive screen, where a countdown clock displayed a string of numbers, hours, minutes, and seconds that were relentlessly ticking down. According to this merciless timer, the apocalypse was only 3 hours away. 3 hours until the mass reanimation, 3 hours until the entities would gain enough energy to unleash their full wrath upon the world. His mind raced. Could he use EternaLife's forsaken technologies to avert the coming doom? His eyes scanned the room and settled on a console labeled Time Reversal Chamber Controls. A flood of adrenaline washed over him as an audacious idea took root. What if he could use the time manipulation technology to reverse the rift itself, to force these entities back into their own dimension? Moving with newfound purpose, Leonard started pulling up schematics, emergency manuals, and override codes. If this were to work, he'd need to construct a makeshift device to channel the facility's experimental technologies into a single focused effort. Scouring through cabinets and drawers, he found coiled wires, crystal oscillators, and old quantum chips, scraps that could turn theory into reality. As he feverishly assembled his creation, another thought struck him, gnawing at the edges of his mind like a worm through an apple. This device would need immense power, more than any of the facility's depleted systems could provide. It would need a life force. It would need a soul. With chilling clarity, Leonard understood what had to be done. His life would be the fuel to seal the rift, his existence the final cost of mankind's salvation. As he integrated a chair into the device, connecting it to a series of electrodes that would channel his life force, the gravity of his decision weighed on him like a mountain. But buried under that mountain was a glimmer of solace, a tiny diamond of purpose. He would die to save the world, and in doing so, fulfill a destiny he never knew he had. The device was ready. The countdown clock continued its merciless march toward zero, each tick a somber drumbeat in this cataclysmic symphony. Leonard took a deep breath, the scent of ionized air filling his nostrils, tinged with a metallic undernote that spoke of complex machinery and scientific wonders gone awry. His eyes met his reflection in a blank monitor, a middle-aged physicist and businessman transformed into the reluctant hero of a horror story beyond comprehension. With a tremble in his hand but steel in his resolve, Leonard keyed in the final sequence that would activate his makeshift rift sealer. The time had come for him to take his place in the chair, to make his final stand against the nightmare spawned from mankind's hubris. He sat down, adjusted the electrodes, and with one last look at the countdown clock, now less than an hour away, he activated the device. As currents surged through him, Leonard felt his consciousness stretch and twist, as if being pulled into multiple dimensions. He thought of Jenna, saved from a terrible fate, and he thought of the thousands, perhaps millions, who would wake up to a world still imperfect but existent, spared from annihilation. In that final moment, Leonard felt a surge of warmth, as if the souls he was fighting to save whispered their thanks from the corners of the universe. Then, with a blinding flash of light that seemed to consume everything, Leonard pressed the final button, fully aware that he was the last line of defense against a cosmic terror. What happened next was a mystery that Leonard would never solve, for his world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of colors, bending, warping, and finally fading to black. The air inside the control room had thickened, every molecule pulsing with an electric tension that prickled Leonard's skin. A deep, guttural growl reverberated through the walls, pulling his attention away from the maze of wires and circuits he had created. Something was coming. He looked up, and there it was, more solid than the others, its outline more defined. This entity was different. This was their leader. Leonard sensed a calculating intelligence in those swirling, abyssal eyes that locked onto his own. There was no doubt. It was aware of what he was trying to do. "What are you?" Leonard whispered, although he knew no human language could ever capture the essence of this being. The entity responded not in words, but in pressure, a mental vice tightening around Leonard's thoughts, images of doom and surrender flooding his consciousness. With a jolt of his remaining willpower, Leonard fought back. He was no stranger to the battle of the mind. He had spent years in the rigorous intellectual arenas of physics and business. This was another problem to solve, another puzzle to conquer. But time was running out. The countdown clock showed less than 15 minutes now. Leonard's eyes darted between the device and the entity. A tactical chess game was in play, and he was on the clock. With a rush of desperate energy, Leonard lunged for the activation lever. The entity surged forward, a dark bolt of malevolent intention. Just as its form reached Leonard, he slammed the lever home. A blinding surge of light erupted from the device, entangling the entity in luminous threads that seemed spun from the fabric of reality itself. As the device roared to life, Leonard felt his vision blur, his senses dull. His life force was draining away, siphoned into the machine's insatiable maw. But he held on, clinging to the wisp of his existence, refusing to fade until he was sure the job was done. And then, with a sound like the tearing of a cosmic veil, it was over. The entity let out an anguished wail that resounded in unseen dimensions, its form disintegrating, sucked back into the rift as it sealed shut. Leonard felt a final rush of triumph, even as the edges of his world started to darken. He turned to the countdown clock. It had stopped. Reanimation sequence initiated. The screen below it flashed. Leonard's last moments were awash in a mix of sorrow and satisfaction. He thought of his past life, of the loved ones he would never see again, but also of the untold lives he had saved. As his consciousness flickered for the final time, Leonard felt the walls of the control room blur, heard the far-off hum of reanimating cryopods, and smelled the cold, sterilized air one last time. His final thought was a simple hope that those emerging into this new world would make better choices than he and his generation had. Then, as the reanimation sequences hummed to life in pods throughout the facility, Leonard's world faded to peaceful black. Years later, the EternaLife facility stood as an empty, haunted husk, a place of legends, myths, and ghost stories. It was a relic of a time when humanity had reached too far, too fast, heedless of the dangers lurking in the unknown. Though civilization had moved on, now full of people who had been given a second chance, no one would ever know how close they had come to never waking up. No one, that is, except for the phantoms and echoes in a long-abandoned control room, where a stopped countdown clock remained as an unspoken monument to the man who had sacrificed everything for a world he would never see. And so, the world continued to spin, its people living and dying, loving and losing, completely unaware that they owed their existence to a single, irreplaceable soul, Leonard, the physicist, the businessman, the reluctant hero of a story that would never be told. But somewhere in the framework of the universe, in the fabric of time and space, Leonard's sacrifice resonated. A quiet note in the cacophonous symphony of existence. A note of hope, of redemption, and perhaps of a lesson finally learned. And so, dear listeners, we draw the curtain on Leonard's tale, a haunting saga where the clock was the real monster, ticking down to oblivion. A facility meant to cheat death became a gateway to horrors beyond human comprehension. Leonard made his choice, but would you have done the same? As you lay down tonight and close your eyes, remember, some choices have ramifications that ripple across the tapestry of time and space. Until we meet again, this is your Keeper of Fears, signing off from our scary stories. Keep that night light on, because you never know what lurks in the darkness, or in the light, for that matter. This is our Scary Stories signing off for tonight.